And the person responded with something Robert Jeffress said, that God is in favor of walls, right?
Yes,
walls
Nehemiah.
are biblical.
Yeah.
Totally from Nehemiah. And when he said that, I thought it was kind of tongue-in-cheek. Maybe he doesn't actually believe it. It sounds a little bit insincere. But then this person, Tim, doubled down and quoted Acts 17:26, basically the old verse that segregationists used to use, right?
The Bob Jones verse.
Exactly.
I have a sermon on my phone about using language.
I thought, oh my gosh, so...
All right, cool. Well, this is going to be, I think, a very spicy episode. We have Sergio Gonzalez and Lloyd Barba with me. Both great to meet both of you, really. Let's just start with some introductions, because I don't know a lot about you guys. Bradley Onishi over at Straight White American Jesus got us connected. He's a friend of the show, a great human, big fan. But we're going to be talking about immigration today, which obviously is such a timely conversation. And I want to get into all of it as soon as possible. So let's start with introductions, then we'll get into it. Sergio, why don't you go first?
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having us, Tim. So I'm an assistant professor of history at Marquette University, lifelong Midwesterner, born and raised in Wisconsin. Both my folks are originally from Mexico. And like Lloyd, I am deeply invested in understanding the history of our country's immigration past, so that we can understand the future of our country's relationship with immigration. And so, as a scholar of Latino religion, labor, and migration, I study a lot of stuff. But for our conversation today, I think probably most pertinent, I'm a historian of the sanctuary movement. So I'm really excited to dig into this conversation and talk about the historical precedents, the historical past of the sanctuary movement, and what it means for us today.
Love that.
All right. So I'm Lloyd Barba. I'm an assistant professor of religion at Amherst College. I'm also core faculty in the Latinx, Latin American Studies program. Originally from Northern California, Stockton, California. And much like Sergio's story, I feel like Sergio lived the Midwest version that I lived in California coast. Parents are from Mexico, actually from the same state that Sergio's parents are from. So I've been studying religious history for quite some time. My main field is American religious history. But in part of my grad training, also did quite a bit of study, doctoral exams in immigration history, race, ethnicity, and so on, U.S.-Mexico borderlands. And I'm really excited to be talking about this, mostly because sanctuary has become relevant in a way we hope it wouldn't, right? So no one wants sanctuary to be a topic. No one wants sanctuary to happen. It's detractors and the supporters. But here we are, Tim, in this moment with the second, Trump presidency right around the corner. And we're ready to talk about it. And also just briefly mention, I am grew up in a Mexican Catholic household, but in my teenage years found myself in a rather sectarian Pentecostal church.
Nice.
It was so sectarian, so Pentecostal that we didn't even consider ourselves evangelical, but man, we fit the bill in every single definition possible. So I know that world quite well, and a lot of the attendant theologies and such.
Matthew Taylor, who just wrote the book The Violent Take It by Force, he has a quadrant he uses. So it sounds like you would fit in like the independent charismatic sect of that, based on what you just said. So yes, okay, that makes sense. And Sergio, how about for you? Did you grow up religious, Christian? Like, what is your background?
Yeah, I grew up Catholic and stayed Catholic. So I grew up in a Catholic family. As I always tell people, we went to church a lot. It wasn't because we were very devout. It's because my mom was a labor and immigration justice organizer. And so she saw the church as not just a place of fellowship, but as a place of social movement building. And so from a young age, I saw my mom up at the lectern, after Mass, trying to get people riled up about the Catholic social teaching and remembering the dignity of the worker that's at the heart of the Catholic Church. And so I am not an evangelical, but I have a deep relationship with my faith, primarily nowadays through its teachings of respecting human dignity.
Well, Lloyd, if you grew up like me, then Sergio and his Catholicism were definitely heretical in my book. We had to pray because Sergio had a works-based salvation, and we were grace-filled. So
it didn't work. The prayers didn't work.
They had to pray harder.
They had to pray the Guadalupe out of me, but she's still our mother, man. We can't get away from it.
I love it. I love it. No, this is great. And you guys produce, it's a podcast series, is that correct? Called Sanctuary.
Mm-hmm.
Give the audience, because I want to plug it now while we have, probably the most listeners. People tend to drop off towards the end, which is typical. What is the podcast and where can folks find it? And what is the premise?
Yeah, so I'll give the quick plug here. Lloyd and I have been deeply engaged in sanctuary research for some years now. We've been working on an edited volume that we're hoping will come out soon with New York University Press. That's super academic. We're really proud of it, but it might not be the most accessible, type of information for a broad audience. And so we were approached by Brad with this opportunity to take all this great research we're doing and make it really legible, readable for a broader audience. And what better way to do it than podcasts, right? And so this last year, Lloyd and I spent hours and hours and hours putting the seven-part limited series together, which is really an introduction to the sanctuary movement. We see it as an invitation for broad communities, whether they're religious, whether they're engaged in immigration activism, whether they're just everyday Americans who want to know more about this phenomenal movement, right? This really spectacular movement, one of the most successful social movements in the history of this country. And so it finished up airing right before the November election. It's all available through Access Mundi for people to listen to, and we hope people will engage with it with the intention of doing something, right? So hopefully we get a chance to talk about liberation theology, one of this thread that runs through the way we do our work as scholars. But, at the heart of liberation theology is see, judge, and act. And we want to make sure that people act once they hear this podcast.
I love that. No, I'm on board, man. My head, I want to pull every single thread that we can, like right away. So one thing at a time. I can do it, Tim. Brace yourself. Okay. Yeah, get organized. Okay, let's start here. What is the sanctuary movement? Let's just start real big picture, then we'll start pulling on threads. The sanctuary movement, something I really have never heard of growing up in my church tradition, never really was aware of. I have a hunch of what it might be, but I don't really know. So either one of you can speak freely. What is the sanctuary movement?
Yeah, so I'll plug 2 points and then hand it off to Seth if you want to fill in anything else. So first, I'd say it's the most robust social justice movement since the history of the civil rights movement. Number 2, our dear friend, historian Christina Scholl, says it's the largest mass mobilization against immigrant detention in American history. So that's going from the 1980s to the present day. It's a much bigger, much more important movement than the historiography, than the literature on it really suggests, and it's developing.
Yeah, so let me give you some of the hard facts here, Tim, to think about this, right? So this movement starts in the 1980s. There are a bunch of Central American revolutions happening in places like El Salvador and Guatemala. These revolutions end up killing 250,000 people. They displace 2 million more, 2 million refugees who are left looking for some form of safe harbor. A lot of those people arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border and they ask for political asylum, which is their legal right in the 1980s to do. It turns out, however, the U.S. government functionally denies them, just kind of en masse, any sort of political asylum in the United States. Now, you have American churches who are at the U.S.-Mexico border who are watching this happening, and they're saying, wait a minute, these people very obviously are fleeing civil war. They're fleeing political persecution. Why aren't they being allowed into the country? What they realize that the U.S. government is funding, right? They're sending hundreds of millions of dollars into this region to try to stop the flow of communism into the United States. So the U.S. can't acknowledge these people as refugees, or else they have to acknowledge their role in destabilizing those countries in the first place.
Pause.
All right.
Did you just say that the U.S. government was actually complicit or funding the destabilization of those countries, causing mass displacement of up to 2 million people?
Yeah. I mean, and this is,
and we have literature, we have data on this. This is not a conspiracy theory. We're not QAnon. I have to say it because my audience comes out of, and I'm one of them, the white evangelical tradition. So when I hear crazy claims, I think RFK, I think QAnon. Mm-hmm. So data matters, of course, to all of us. So 100%. There's literature behind this.
There is bounds and bounds of literature. I mean, this is established historical fact. And in fact, Tim, it is just another kind of like data point in a century-long history of U.S. intervention in Latin America, right? I mean, there's this classic saying in Latino studies, right? That's like, before we were here, you were there. In other words, before Latinos came to the United States, it's because the United States was intervening in Latin America, right? So this is kind of, it's established fact. So these people arrive at the border. Churches are like, wait a minute, these people are obviously refugees. What's going on? Why aren't they being allowed into the country? They get very frustrated with the U.S. government. And after pleading with the U.S. government to change their policy, they say, you know what, we're going to do it ourselves. So in 1982, they opened their church doors as places of sanctuary for these asylum seekers, and they do it knowing that they might be breaking federal law. And I mean, it's this phenomenal kind of like this confrontation with the state. They basically say, if you're not going to follow not just U.S. international refugee law, but the higher law of God to welcome the stranger, we will do that type of work ourselves. And it sets off this decade-long movement to not only provide humanitarian aid to these people, but to try to force the U.S. government to do their job.
And was it successful to force the U.S. government to do their job?
Lloyd?
Yeah, so in fact it was. One of the co-founders of the movement, John Fife, he was pastor of Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson. When I spoke to him back in 2018 in Tucson at the church, I asked him, so was it a success? Did you all win? And again, co-founder, right? No small player, no small fish in this.
Right.
He very forthright said, yes, we won. And it was because they forced the federal government through a settlement. This is a case known as ABC, American Baptist Churches et al. Versus Thornburg. Basically, the U.S. government had to reconsider the cases that had been dismissed and also evaluate asylum applications with new criteria. Basically, the asylum application cases had been reviewed with such high bar that of those who applied, which wasn't a majority of those coming over into the U.S., of the Salvadoran Guatemalans who applied for asylum, in like 1986 or 87, it was something like ranging, depending on the nationality, between 1.8% to about 2.4% who actually got asylum granted. And Tim, the context that they were fleeing were just utterly violent. Their testimony spoke to violence. I mean, every testimony I've read, the violence, I can't get into it here. It's way too gruesome. But people had to detail these stories over and over and over to try to, get an asylum claim. And sort of the really kind of wretched irony is they're having to deny their real home, right? Where they come, the place they come to live and love, they have to deny home to make new home. And most of them are caught being denied home here in the U.S. So yeah, the sanctuary movement responds with a really robust religious and prophetic response.
Well, that's actually encouraging, because where we're living right now in history, I should say the most public dominant Christian response, right, is this anti-immigration. They're stealing our jobs. There's all, listen, when it comes to Christian nationalism, I'm in the thick of it. I go to all the events. I'm going back to America Fest in just a few short weeks from this recording. I was there last year when Charlie Kirk said that a bunch of third worlders were destroying Minneapolis, Minnesota, even though statistically that isn't even the case. So I hear this stuff all the time. Okay, I absolutely do. So we are a far cry from what you just described in the general zeitgeist and air of what we're breathing when it comes to Christian and immigration. Most people, when they hear those two things, are going to think people who want to build the wall, who don't want immigrants, which really, let's be honest, it's really brown people. No one in their minds thinking about some blonde, blue-eyed person from Canada or from Europe being smuggled over the border by boat. We're thinking about people coming across the southern border who have a certain kind of look to them, right? That's who we think of. And so hearing you say that, when I was born in 88, so hearing you say that, through the 80s and on, there was a deeply religiously motivated movement to protect asylum seekers, even from the state that was denying them, is really encouraging. And I'm wondering if that's still happening today. Like, are there these deep, it sounds like almost like a Underground Railroad-esque kind of vibe of like, it's very secret, it's very underground, intentionally to move people made in the image of God who the state deems not worthy of protection into a space of being protected because their teachings, or the teachings of their God, Jesus, tells them to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the movement started in 1982, and it is still very much around today, right? I mean, it ends in the early 1990s with the end of these civil wars in Central America, but the reverberations of this movement continue. Many of the original movement members are radicalized, and I don't mean radicalized in that they become, leftist ideologues. I mean radicalized in the idea that they go to the root of their faith, which of course is to serve those who have been pushed to the margins of their society. So many of these people get involved in migrant ministry at the U.S.-Mexico border. And then when deportations began to ramp up under President Bush and President Obama, they decide it is their obligation to restart the sanctuary movement. So in the late aughts, religious leaders restart the movement. They call it the New Sanctuary Movement, and they begin to open their churches again. This time, not to Central American asylum seekers, but now to people who have lived in this country for decades, who consider themselves Americans in all ways except for legal documentation, who have families, who have roots, who have jobs in this place, but are now facing the prospect of being detained and deported from the place that they call home. So these churches, again, take up the charge. And since that period, we have been involved in kind of waves of sanctuary movement activism that is often happening in response to what the historian Adam Goodman refers to as the deportation machine. As it ramps up and gets louder, after the 2016 election, the sanctuary movement gets back into action. And after this 2024 election, Lloyd and I have been in conversation with faith leaders. Congregations all across the country, faith organizations across the country are again considering what is their obligation to restart the sanctuary movement in 2025.
So you said under Bush and Obama. So
That's right.
I appreciate that because, a lot of people think that we're just leftist, or Obama wasn't really a leftist, but, Democratic sycophants. And that isn't the case. I tell people all the time, I'm like, listen, my allegiance is to the way of Jesus. And the reason why I even try and stay away from the label, even progressive Christian, is because anything can turn fascist. It doesn't have to be just a right-wing thing. And I don't want to be pigeonholed to Democratic or progressive or leftist, whatever it is. I want to have allegiance to Jesus and to the way of the liberative Christian tradition that is kind of my anchor there. So can you talk more about that? Because frankly, I was always against Obama at that age. I was listening to talk radio and he was the worst person since, the devil himself to come to earth. That's just what you're taught, So I didn't really know what he was doing or what he wasn't doing. So immigrant deportations also increased under an Obama administration as well?
Yeah, that's right. So again, I think part of the explanation is that Obama had two terms, right, to carry out mass deportations. So as of right now, he's still carrying out more mass deportations than Trump. We'll see what that looks like after Trump's promise of the largest mass deportation campaign in American history.
Right.
Again, we have yet to see. But yeah, the sanctuary movement it officially restarted again in 2007, but there's a 2006 case in Chicago with Elvira Arellano who sort of kickstarted the new sanctuary movement. And that kept a pace for years. It sort of tapered off a little bit in the mid-2010s. But when Trump came to the scene with his very clear, right, not just xenophobic rhetoric, but a xenophobic platform, right? It was about the wall in 2016. And this time around, it's about mass deportation. So the sanctuary movement didn't lose momentum the minute Obama was elected. In fact, more people were starting to take sanctuary at the time. And the hope, Tim, was always for comprehensive immigration reform. And we had a high tide of pro-immigration justice movements and initiatives right around 2006 to 2008. Again, if there's a moment was going to happen, that was going to be it. But ultimately, what we got was just piecemeal reform. So again, important things. I don't want to discount, things like DACA, like deferred action for childhood arrivals. That is important. But what folks were really hoping for is for a path to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country at the time. But that didn't happen. And so there's been sort of a loss of faith, if you will, in either parties delivering on that promise.
And Tim, let me just add this, if listeners who will tune into our podcast will realize that Lloyd and I have fire for all political parties, right? Because if there is one reality about immigration politics in this country is that this has been probably one of the issues where we've had bipartisan consensus since the 1990s. I mean, under the Clinton administration, we had some of the most regressive, draconian, inhumane forms of immigration policies that you can imagine, right? I mean, the type of policies that were pushing people into the Sonoran Desert, into just completely ridiculous situations where they were dying en masse. They try to cross the U.S.-Mexico border, right? As Lloyd mentioned, Obama earned the moniker from immigration activists as the deporter-in-chief, and he will probably hold that title until President Trump actually executes on the plans that he said. And so immigrants are not tied, and specifically immigrant justice activists are certainly not tied to a political party because no political party has ever done right by them. And I think the sanctuary movement kind of follows the similar vein, right? This is not about partisan politics. It's about justice for those who have been pushed to the margins of society.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about President Biden tried to pass one of the most conservative bipartisan immigration bills, but Trump killed it because it didn't look good on him. And I think about, I mean, I was at the DNC for all 4 or 5 nights. It was a big focus on securing the border for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And let's kind of talk about that because that term securing the border, it kind of sounds like the same phrase law and order. It doesn't mean what you think it means, right? At the same time, I'm not very familiar with anyone. I mean, I've met one or two people who said open borders is the solution for everything. I'm like, okay, I'm open to hearing your case, but I'm not aware of anyone who's like, you know what? We want no security at any border. We just want wide open borders. Like, who cares? I'm not aware of anyone who really thinks that. I think it's more of like a talking point. So for you guys, like, how do you think about immigration and and how the Christian, but also even a state, should be viewing what's going on, especially given what you said earlier, that the U.S. has kind of been responsible for destabilizing some of these regions that have kind of forced people to be displaced?
Yeah, so I can tackle a little bit within context of sanctuary specifically. Okay, so immigration, the category of who's an immigrant, none of that's sort of a natural category. It's always constructed within like U.S. political discourse, right? Politicians have new agendas depending on the time. So let me give two answers from sanctuary. The first, the Refugee Act of 1980 clearly defined him. A refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution for politics, race, ethnicity, political affiliation, etc. Okay, a well-founded fear. When the Reagan administration refused to uphold that for those coming over the border, again, arriving on foot, really beat up, looking like the term for the Good Samaritan, half dead, if you will. That Refugee Act was not applied to Central Americans. So then churches, synagogues as well, but in large part, I'll just say people of faith, they looked to the Bible to say, what is our responsibility to the stranger, to welcome them? How can we abide by the words of Jesus? So they purported that their law, the biblical law, God's law, is a higher law. Okay, so they said if the Reagan administration is not going to uphold the category of refugee, we're going to do that. Now, let's fast forward to the new sanctuary movement, which again kicks off in the mid-aughts of the 2000s. Well, at that point, as Sergio said, we have families that have been here. In some cases, the parents of these families have been here for more than half of their lives. They say, we are Americans. So that's a very different kind of solution, right, to what's like then framed as immigration crisis.
Right.
And in that case, it's saying, again, let's just be super realistic for a second. So many arguments about immigration boil down to economy, as though immigrants' existence needs to be rationalized by numbers. And that's how policy gets moved. I get it. We got to the point with the new sanctuary movement and the pro-immigration movement of the mid-aughts that it would have made far more sense economically to find a path for legalization for immigrants who are paying into Social Security, who are paying taxes, who are working and not taking any of the benefits of Social Security and such, for them to actually become permanent members, permanent residency or citizenship. That was the battle then. Now we have with sort of the border that Trump, realistically, he built like 52 miles of the border, additional border. He mostly just reinforced existing border. But Trump built up the border in the minds. And I think he played into well-worn arguments about immigration, ideas of invasion, ideas of, a mass number of people coming over. And he was able to build up that platform or that speaking point during Biden's 4 years, right? Open borders. Tim, that doesn't exist. If you think America is an open border, please go down to the border. That's just not the case. And so, what immigrant advocates and immigrants themselves have been advocating for, it's always shifted. And so I'll hand it off to Seth if you want to add anything else. But I just want to give the long arc. It's moving, it's dynamic, and Sanctuary responds in kind, always adhering to the words of Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's always missing in these conversations, Tim, is the question of human dignity, right? And the individual. I mean, you said kind of in the image of how these people are made in the image of God, all of us are. And so when we kind of see these as masses, as surges, as this crisis, these caravans that are coming to attack us at the border, we lose sight of the fact that we're talking about individual human beings. And the thing that I always mention with people, whether I'm talking at a public library or an academic setting, right, is that we need to remember that if you were in the situation where you were living in Guatemala or Mexico or Honduras, and your family was facing persecution, or your family was facing hunger and deprivation,
Right.
what would you do?
Right.
What would you do if you were a father and you had a family, if you were a mother and you had a family, and you had to provide for that family? You were scared for your family's well-being, that they wouldn't be able to survive another day. Would you not do the exact same thing? And so what's often missing in these conversations is any sort of humanity to understand what is the plight that people are facing and what is our obligation as a country of plenty, right? And that is not to deny the fact that people are suffering in the United States, but that doesn't mean that we can't, walk and chew gum at the same time. There is plenty that we can do as a country to try to provide for people who are asking for support, especially as we mentioned earlier, Tim, when the United States has this long relationship of functionally screwing over Latin America for over a century.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think about it kind of with that both and of like on a pragmatic level to convince the broad population. I do think I'm like, why wouldn't we want to legalize everyone who's here so they can pay into the system? And also, so those people get protections from being exploited by contractors and farms, et cetera, right? Because those people can earn under minimum wage and they have no legal recourse because they have no actual, status or numbers. So pragmatically, I'm like, I don't get the push to deport everyone economically, financially. It just makes no sense. Maybe for a few for-profit, industrial prison complexes, for sure. Maybe for some billionaires it does. But for the average American, it makes no sense. And then the other side of it, though, is, again, as a Christian, what you just said, Sergio, of like, these are human beings with real stories. And and media is so powerful in how it dehumanizes the other, especially people who don't look or talk like us, or don't maybe have the same native language that we do, have a different cultural background. We tend to see those people shaped by our media as invaders, or, the big narrative in right-wing media, as I'm sure you both know, is that what they do so well is they'll take anecdotal pieces of evidence and they'll attach it to the entire group. I'm sure you're all familiar with Laken Riley, I think her name was. Obviously a tragic, horrible story. Like a family today does not have their daughter. I don't know anyone who would ever try and justify what that man did to her, and obviously he's facing justice for it, for sure. But we also know that statistically, immigrants, especially undocumented ones, are half as likely to commit crimes of all kinds than their native-born counterpart, according to the Cato Institute. But for right-wing media, they'll take that one story, apply it to the entire swath of people, and then say this is why they have to go, because they are complicit in what this person did. And I just think, even though it's so factually inaccurate, it is so effective in terms of propaganda when you live in a country that is based on a rhetoric, indirect or direct, of white supremacy. I mean, we have to call out at some point in this conversation the massive white elephant in the room, that the anti-immigration sentiment comes from a long legacy of white supremacist ideology from the KKK onward, and that gets reinterpreted and re-explained and re-communicated to a new generation every couple decades or so to have the same outcome, which is that we need to protect our own. These people are invaders and they have nothing to offer us. And now we have to run campaigns to deport people who have established their lives here with their kids because we are in danger of them. And it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, Tim, I think you're hitting it right in the head. And I think this is one of the biggest problems, is that there is a very consistent messaging for anti-immigrant fear-mongering. Yeah. What there hasn't been in this country is a consistent messaging of how we welcome the stranger. And so that's why Lloyd and I are so invested in understanding the sanctuary movement as a historical phenomenon, but also something that perhaps offers us a pathway for moving forward, right? I mean, when we talk about the two dominant political parties in our country, they are both kind of mired in the same type of thinking. I mean, one just has like really racist, white supremacist language that they use. The other doesn't take any time to offer an alternative. And so the sanctuary movement, which doesn't fit neatly within these partisan divides, offers us something different, right? It's to say that when we look at people as human beings, we understand them not as economic widgets or as potential murderers, right? When we see them as people, perhaps there's a different way to understand not just how we, lay out our language about immigration, but how we develop our politics about immigration, how we welcome people who are different from us, but who want to be in this country, who are not here to take from us, but here just to live, right? To be, and potentially will contribute. That shouldn't be our number one answer, but really who are here to just be our neighbors as well.
Yeah, and Tim, I'll follow up on that. 2 quick points to something you mentioned. So the Laken Riley case, I mean, I don't know of anyone who tries to justify that murder. It's awful, it's lamentable, it's wrong in every way. What I find interesting, though, you said the kind of really sort of attaching to cases that are far, far in the minority, really rare, exceptional. So the Laken Riley case also becomes a way of right-wing politicians to try to justify their attacks against sanctuary cities. Now, in this case, the Laken Riley case has nothing to do with the sanctuary city. And all the empirical research we have, along the lines of what you already suggested, it shows that in sanctuary cities, number one, there's a greater cooperation between immigrants and police forces or law enforcement more generally. And sanctuary cities are actually safer. And why does it work that way? Well, again, if you're an undocumented immigrant, you don't fear talking to the police because they're not going to inquire about your immigration background. So again, better cooperation, a kind of community policing, however people want to put it. So yeah, it becomes an entry point. I mean, there's a similar case in San Francisco. We actually talk about the Laken Riley case in our podcast, as well as that of Kate Steinle in San Francisco, which again, behind that, there's Kate's Law that politicians like Ted Cruz and others try to advance. And it's the case, in Kate Steinle's, in that incident where, the jury found that the guy was acquitted of all charges, right? The undocumented immigrant who held the gun that went off, he was acquitted. But that doesn't stop people from advancing this sort of larger narrative of Trump is on record saying he invented the term migrant crime. He said it the last couple of months, right? And he's been quite effective at that. And Tim, I challenge, your listeners who are on Instagram and TikTok, when they look at images of immigration, to think of it in light of what one academic, Leo Chavez, calls the Latino threat narrative. So, the images at the border, they're going to try to show invasion, chaos, militarization, suggesting that only the military can fix this problem. And I think that's going to translate into Trump deploying federal troops to round up folks for mass deportation. The narrative of this, what he calls an infinity line, what Leo Chavez calls an infinity line. Oh, the line of people coming to the U.S. is so long. It's outside of the frame of this photo. There's that happens. Crossing over the river with families, like entire families are coming. Tim, this kind of media coverage goes back to at least the post-1965 Immigration Act, where a lot of xenophobes just reacted and thought, oh, if we open up the borders to immigration, the whole world's going to come in. This is just classic sort of media move that you see, again, not just on the covers of old magazines, but you see it all over TikTok. So I challenge people to really think about what's constructing their idea of immigration, the mass numbers and such, the crisis, the chaos, and let's go back to human dignity, as Sergio suggested. That's where it's at.
Hi friends, if you're enjoying this video, I have a favor to ask. The New Evangelicals is a 501c3 nonprofit, and if you've looked around at all, you've probably noticed that we don't offer member subscriptions on YouTube or Patreon options. The reason for this is very simple. It's been our mission since the beginning to offer all of our content and community resources completely paywall free. What this means is that we are completely dependent on the generosity of people like you who donate to make this work possible and accessible for all. If our content has helped you, would you consider donating to keep it all going? You can find the link in the description of this video, and to be very clear, this is not about giving to God or something like that. We're not a church and this is not a tithe. The ask is so simple. If our work has helped you, would you be willing to help us make this content accessible to more and more people? All donations made in the US are tax deductible and every bit helps. Thank you for your generosity. This might be a little bit outside of your formal expertise, but if it is, just give me your opinions. But have you thought about, how effective, the billionaire class is at making lower class people think that lower class people are the enemy? Like, I'm thinking about, how the average, even white blue collar worker who is probably just trying to make it, maybe they own a small business and they're killed with different kinds of government fees. And I know this because I worked in small business. I worked in small business construction. I know how much workman's comp costs and how much your insurances cost and just your tax bill. Like I know that. And, you have those people who are just trying to make it work. And the system is rigged against them and the employees that they employ. I mean, even the tax burden is crazy for a business, a small business, while corporate, businesses have all kinds of lawyers to get through all kinds of loopholes. But they're convinced that it's not Elon Musk that's close to Trump that is the threat, the billionaire, richest man, I think, on the planet. It is the person trying to escape actual persecution, trying to make a better life for themselves, who is here and doesn't have papers to show for it. That's the real threat to that person's well-being. Have you guys thought about that at all? Do you talk about that in the podcast? Because it is, when you say it like that, it's pretty wild, right? But propaganda is so effective that people don't put two and two together, that Elon Musk has a huge incentive to be next to President Trump to advance his own economic interests as he continues to suck up money like a vacuum cleaner, while the blue-collar worker suffers and thinks that, oh, well, Elon's right. The immigrant is my real threat. They're going to take my job. No. The billionaires are taking your jobs, friends. The billionaires are the ones extracting the wealth from you, not the immigrant. But again, right-wing media, it's very effective.
Yeah, Tim, we don't cover that as much in this podcast because it'd have to be like a 30-part series for us to do it well. Although maybe that's like a future job. And
Brad, you heard that 30-part series, you know?
You know what, like 2025 is going to bring us even more topics to cover. But here's what I'll say. I mean, like, I think Elon Musk is a perfect example, since he's turned into like one of the country's biggest anti-immigrant crusaders. Amazingly, I mean, this is a very sudden turn, and any reporting that anyone's read on Elon Musk and his very tenuous relationship with the immigration system when he was in this country originally as a student in California, right? So, but I think we just have to point to this thing. At the same time that he is calling for shutting down the border, he is advocating for the expansion of specific types of immigrant visas so that he can bring in workers that will help him in his industries, right? So it's not that he's opposed to immigration. He's just opposed to the immigration he doesn't like. Right. And he certainly wants immigrants to come here if they're going to help him in his specific business. And that doesn't make Elon Musk special. That just makes him fit into the larger stream of how businesses have used immigrants since, the 19th century for their own gains, whether it's like to break unions at the turn of the century and bringing in strike breakers, often without those people who were being brought in, knowing that they were being brought in as scabs, whether it's in the 1980s when business was lobbying for immigration laws that would allow them to continue to hire undocumented labor and do so in a way that could allow them to exploit them, right? Basically to hang their documentation status over them if they tried to unionize, to the present day where you have, big lobbies like agricultural lobbies in the United States who are pushing for specific policies that will allow them to bring over cheap and controllable workers to work in our fields, in our dairy industry, and all of those things that our country needs to survive. And so I think, Tim, you're hitting it right on the head. This is a big stream within immigration history, which is to say, who benefits from our country's immigration system? We often use this idea that our country's immigration system is broken. And it certainly is broken for some people, but for other mega corporations, the immigration system works just fine.
That's important, because I always ask myself, if it's so broken, why can't we fix it? I mean, we have no problem funding the world's largest military every single year. I think it's over $1 trillion or close to it. That's never disputed. If we want to get stuff done, we can, and yet we can't fix the broken immigration system. And honestly, Sergio, hearing you say, well, for some people with power, it works really well, does make a lot of sense of why it's not getting fixed.
I mean, I'll just say this, like I'm in Wisconsin, right? Wisconsin has the number 2 dairy industry in the United States. That the dairy industry in Wisconsin is heavily dependent on undocumented labor, right? A lot of those dairy farmers who hire undocumented workers, we know who they voted for, right? We know who they voted for. And so there's this expectation that they kind of have their cake and eat it too, which is to say, they can hire undocumented workers and then vote for a guy who's going to promise to deport the workers, but they expect it's not actually going to happen. And then we kind of get stuck in this vicious circle, right? I mean, it who ends up getting screwed at the end of the day? It's the people who are stuck in these precarious positions in the first place.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
And that's kind of been the trend, if you will, a long time in agricultural labor, right? You want a pool of people that can be hired and fired and rehired just at a whiff of whim, right? Of anything that might be contrary. And so, it's meant to keep a displaced labor pool. And so if Trump is promising deportation, they figure, we'll get some other people to work these jobs. And so I think they are relying on just unrealistic expectations for, their factory lines or their, the rows of vineyards and orchards to be filled. But we saw with the first Trump presidency some, cases in California where oranges, for example, in the winter season was not being picked and the fruit started to just rot. Why? Folks were afraid to go to work. in large numbers in a place where they'd be very vulnerable for ICE to come and carry out a deportation raid.
And I'll tell you, Tim, that is like the only thing that gives me hope about the next Trump presidency is that people like their cheap produce too much for there actually to be these large deportation forces that are being promised. I think that, just like these conversations about tariffs, it's a lot of it is kind of like big speak, but it's like when the actual pain starts to hit the pocketbook for everyday Americans, and Trump is a populist, so if he feels like he's not not earning the points here from the general public, he's going to pull back on some of the material consequences he's kind of laying out here. Now, but then again, are we talking about with a reliable actor here, right? Who's actually going to work off logic? Probably not. So who knows what's actually coming over the next 4 years?
Yeah, well, and also I would argue more importantly who he's picking to be around him. When you have people like Pete Hegseth and is it Stephen Miller or Russell Vought, these people are I would argue, in my opinion, so I don't get sued for libel, operating off of a white supremacist Christian nationalist mindset that believes that whiteness has to be the dominant status here. I do want to, I might trigger some of my audience, or I might make them think about a deep cut there. So when I was a kid in evangelicalism, we did not always watch just secular movies. I couldn't watch a lot of Disney movies. There was an organization called Feature Films for Families. Okay. And they would call us on the phone and show us some of the newest releases, more popular ones like the Buttercream Gang, for those of you out there who know who they are, different kinds of movies. Like another one was called No More Baths, etc. Well, there was a movie called Friendship's Field. And the premise was a white farmer and his children were farming. They had a big farm. And one year, the girl's dad brought in immigrants from Mexico. And I don't think that they were here legally, or if they were, it was super suspicious. And it was actually a story about this girl meeting a little boy named Oscar, how they became like lifelong friends. It was actually really good. Like really, I got to hand it to him, like really powerful. And like how her opinion changed and how they faced a lot of like anti-immigrant sentiment from other people in the community. Really freaking good story. If that movie came out today in evangelical culture, it'd be called woke, it'd be called indoctrination, it'd be called Marxism. I'm curious for you two as historians. Have you seen, because it's always hard for me to know, is this unprecedented or have we been here before? Are we seeing like an unprecedented level of anti-immigrant sentiment in the cultural zeitgeist, especially the fact that Trump ran off of that and got elected for many people on that? Or is this just one of the big waves that we've seen in history before?
Yeah, so historically, I think certainly we can point to other sort of high tides of xenophobia. We can go back to 19th century Chinese exclusion laws and so on. But to the point where this is really the platform of a major party, right, and a candidate that has not twice, but actually thrice, right? He lost the 2020 election because he actually lost it. That thrice has run on this platform that is just really, grounded on or built upon xenophobia. I think that's exceptional. But also, Sergio and I discussed in episode 5 of the podcast how moving from the sanctuary movement of the 1980s to the new sanctuary movement, we have this, this 15-year period, basically, from, early 90s to mid 2000s, where the immigration, the border, the immigration apparatus, or what Sergio referred to historian Adam Goodman calls a deportation machine, it's all being ramped up, Tim. And we have a test case in California in 1994 with Prop 187, which sought to strip undocumented immigrants of all kinds of social services. And this passed by popular opinion. Now, ultimately, was struck down by Supreme Court, saying, this is a state trying to do federal immigration law, and it just doesn't work. It's more complicated than that, but that's the cliff notes. So we've seen it at the state level, kind of like more smaller laboratories, if you will. But at the national level, again, the guy 3 times has run on this platform. I think that's different and very exceptional. Also, Trump's appointments give me far more worry than in than in earlier years, right? So, in many ways, that sort of rests in I kind of take hope in the fact that, he doesn't appoint a bunch of incompetent people who can't carry out his agenda. This time around, when it comes to immigration, appointments like Tom Homan and you mentioned Stephen Miller, those are folks who have some experience, not just in the rhetoric, but the everyday kind of trying to figure out the nitty gritty, or trying to grease up the deportation machine. So I think there's real concern for that. And one just many more reasons as to why the sanctuary movement will pick up once again.
I want to get pragmatic and down to brass tacks here. Sanctuary movement. There are churches all over the place, especially on the southern border, who are taking in immigrants. What does that actually look like? I mean, so an immigrant family somehow gets across the border. They haven't, undocumented, whatever. A church just randomly finds them and they stay at the church building. Does a family host them? What's it actually look like to protect and to welcome, the foreigner, as the scripture says, in an environment that maybe is kind of dicey legally?
Yeah, so here's what it's looked like over the last 2 decades.
Okay.
The majority of people who have entered into sanctuary have been people who have lived in this country for an extended period of time. So it's not often the asylum seeker who's just arrived across the U.S.-Mexico border. It's often somebody who, as Lloyd mentioned earlier, has a family here, has established connections here. Their kids maybe were born in the United States, and they have something like a detention and deportation. They have a deportation order at hand, right? They've been told by the federal government, you have to leave in X number of days, or we're going to come and get you and take you out.
Got it.
And so sanctuary ends up being the last recourse that they have to stay in this country to remain connected to their family and to their community. When they enter into a sanctuary church, they often go to a network that's already established this commitment to do this type of work. And it's not often just one church. It's a church that's part of a larger network of religious organizations that are going to do this together. They go into this space. They often have a public statement of faith, right, where the congregation is saying, we are going to do this. We want the spotlight on us because we are going to not only offer humanitarian aid to this person, we want the public to begin to kind of reckon with the fact that this individual is about to be torn away from their community, right? So it's a form of public consciousness raising, and hopefully, if done right, a form of educating a larger public about kind of the cruelty of our country's immigration system. Now that person enters into sanctuary, and what they're basically doing is they're giving up their life to be in this space, right? This place, this church, this temple is the place where they're going to live until they have some sort of opportunity to get out with a legal pathway to stay into the United States, right? So until the United States basically pulls that deportation order through any number of different legal mechanisms, that person is basically saying, I live in this church because if I step outside of it, I'm going to get picked up and I'm going to be deported from this country.
And I just don't know. So in this scenario where, let's say there's a family living at the church because they have a deportation order, if the state finds where they are at that church, can they order the church to hand them over? And if the church says no, do they bust down the doors? Is that a real a real possibility to do that? I'm just kind of curious, like, how this works.
So there's no legal protection for sanctuary in U.S. law, none whatsoever. So if an immigration agent wanted to go into a church and detain someone, pull them out, throw them into the ICE van, they can do that. They have every right to do so. What we have noticed, though, is in some cases, not necessarily folks who are in sanctuary, but folks who are in a church, whether they're kind of there for, a warming shelter in the winter season, they've been lured out of churches. So they'll arrest them across the street at the McDonald's parking lot or once they hit the sidewalk. Now, there is, since 2011, the Sensitive Locations Memo, or also called the Protected Places Memo, which advised, again, this isn't law per se, but this is kind of, policy, if you will, for the administration to say, hospitals, schools, and houses of worship, don't arrest people there. Okay? What we've seen, though, at schools, school grounds, at hospitals, people have been arrested, have been detained, okay? Yet, at houses of worship, that has not happened. So there's this sort of cultural value, sort of sacred space of the church that still keeps it as a protected space. And this is where I want to be very clear. Religious sanctuary is different from sanctuary cities, sanctuary campuses, because these religious sanctuaries have been violated in the sense, immigration officers are coming in for the person in a publicly declared sanctuary and saying, hey, time to come with us. And so what churches, the churches I know at least, what they have done to protect the person in the sanctuary, they have to start locking the doors. Some of these churches are in downtown areas. They like to keep their doors open, especially in the winter months. So unhoused folks can come in and get a little bit of respite from the brutal winter. They had to lock doors. Someone was always at the church, so someone even spent the night in a different room to always be there to accompany the person who's in sanctuary. And it is tough, Tim. In this last round of sanctuary with Trump's zero tolerance policy, folks were in sanctuary for 2, 3, almost 4 years. And so there's a serious conversation to be had as to what will sanctuary look like in a Trump 2.0 if it's necessary to reinvoke housing people in houses of worship.
Do you think, and I know that this is speculation, let me just put it out to the audience. I do my best not to unnecessarily, stoke fear in people. There's plenty of things in reality that we can be scared about. Do you think that there is a world, let me rephrase, do you think there's a good chance that there's a world with a new Trump administration where we see police going potentially door to door or building to building saying, we need your papers right now or else we're throwing you in prison? And I say that because, a lot of people, and I'm one of them, have compared similarities to what's happened in other times in world history in other countries in Europe, maybe, for example, just arbitrarily throwing out names, maybe like Germany or something, where there were, police doing things like that to a minority group of people, the Jewish people. And while I'm not someone who would say Trump is Hitler, there are certainly some tactics that I've seen by how this right-wing movement has utilized propaganda very effectively to target certain outgroups of people in society, blaming them for all of their woes. And so in my mind, if Trump gets what he wants, I certainly could see that. But also, you're the historians, you're the experts here. If I'm wrong, I would love to know that. What do you guys think? Is that a real possibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in conversations with both immigration lawyers and immigration scholars, I don't see that as a possibility, mostly because of a capacity question, right? It's just that the United States doesn't have enough police power behind its immigration and customs enforcement and border patrol, even though border patrol is the largest law force in the United States, right? But even in that case, it doesn't have enough people to do this work. Now, that's why he's talking about bringing in the military, which is complicated and would be potentially breaking laws. That's why Republican governors are pledging to use National Guard troops to do this type of work too, right? Because it's just a capacity question. So I think what scholars have predicted will happen in probably a mid to worst case scenario is that we will have kind of these very showy examples of the Trump administration performing raids at work sites and perhaps doing very targeted raids on neighborhoods, but mostly with the impact of stoking more and more fear in the communities, right? To keep it as an active question in the media and within the minds of undocumented communities. And so I think it's impossible. I mean, it just is impossible for the federal government to round up 10 to 15 million undocumented people, to place them in concentration camps, and then to process the deportation. There's just a capacity issue. And then there is that little thing of the US law, right? I mean, people have the right to court cases before they are detained and deported. And so even if he's only in office for 4 years, there's just no way he can do it. That doesn't mean that these next 4 years are not going to be terribly difficult and terribly scary. But in terms of him actually executing on this promise to detain and deport all undocumented people in this country, it's just really not feasible.
Yeah, I think ultimately too, the Trump presidency, we saw it the first time, it'll be no different second time. It's largely a PR campaign, right? So what Trump is going to want to do, he's going to want to boast numbers. And folks in this cabinet have already talked about this, right? They've talked about trying to, again, the terms used, net the first 1 million undocumented immigrants. They don't call them that. They say illegals, right? So they care about the sort of numbers. To achieve those numbers, I think they're going to go to the old methods that we saw in the 1930s with the Mexican repatriation, right? The scapegoat of one of the scapegoats of the Great Depression, Mexicans. So what do? Anywhere between a quarter to a third of Mexicans are deported in the 1930s. With Operation Wetback in the 1950s, it's these deportation raids to really kind of net these big numbers. But we do have, some of the folks who were in sanctuary talked about experiences with ICE, where ICE came to their door, knocked on the door, said they're looking for someone else. The minute they opened the door, they've entered and they detained them. So I think, yeah, largely in order to try to get the big numbers, it might be raids and efforts sort of to net, right? Whether it's raiding an agricultural site where there's people working, or sort of the garment factories in places like Los Angeles, all throughout the borderlands. That's a potential, but we shouldn't preclude the possibility of going into homes, especially when they're trying to net entire families. Now, I think another thing we're going to see as part of this PR campaign presidency is trying to target people with violent backgrounds in order to say we are targeting these hardened criminals. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, will tacitly, at least for many Americans, say like, oh, okay, well, Trump campaign's doing a good thing. And I think, they might just be writing off the zeitgeist. The Public Religion Research Institute just put out numbers recently on this new 2024 American Value Survey.
Oh, yeah.
Tim,
that's Robbie Jones, right? PRRI?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Of almost half of the U.S. population is in favor of mass deportation.
I know. I saw that stat over at Notre Dame. It was shocking.
Mm-hmm.
It was
way up from even 2020.
Yeah. Oh, massively up. And I think that's a product of the last 8 years, almost 10 years, really, of this anti-immigrant platforms.
Yeah, I mean, we can get into the right-wing media and even mainstream media, just how they present this stuff, and that's a whole different discussion for a different day. That's really important, I think, for us to recognize. I have a few more questions if you guys have a few more minutes. I won't go too much longer, and I do want to do a lightning round where I throw you the propaganda I hear and have you respond to it directly. So we will definitely be doing that in a minute. Kind of last question before we get there. As Christians, or at least people who grew up Christian, how do you see, it really is amazing to watch how Christian nationalism can do the mental gymnastics of like saying we believe in the Bible is clear on all these topics, and then they can just overlook the dozens of commands to welcome the foreigner, love the immigrant, etc. Right? I mean, it's truly uncanny. It really is. Like the gay people, the Bible's clear, but the immigrant, well, it's not what you really think. But, the interesting thing is, especially what you two were talking about when it comes to liberation theology, and really just, even a broader Christian orthodoxy, how do you respond to some of those theological, gymnastics when you see people trying to really justify that as Christians, we should be the ones, like, for example, one of them is, I know the Bible says love your neighbor. I have an obligation to love my American neighbor first, like that is who I have to love, not my immigrant neighbor. How do you respond to that stuff as people of faith?
Oh, man. That was Stuckey who said that one, right? About my American neighbor.
Stuckey, William. There's William Wolfe, Joel Webbin, Doug Wilson. I can give you all the names.
Yeah,
it's in their ecosystem.
So sure. I'll just tell you. So just yesterday, I had a friend who sent me an Instagram post from someone we both knew growing up, and someone had asked them. They had mentioned something political, that they're going to be in an event with Charlie Kirk.
Oh my!
Right. God. Then they see this as such a moment of like elevation and platform. Like, oh my gosh, we're being such a Christian witness by now being Charlie Kirk's turned to TPUSA Faith events.
Yes.
So.
Great.
And
I'll probably see them in 2 weeks then.
Exactly, you're right. So someone had
lucky, yeah.
Yeah, you might. But someone had responded in a similar kind of post about elections. How about when Jesus talks about caring for the stranger, caring for the immigrant, Leviticus, don't oppress the immigrant, so on. And the person responded with something Robert Jeffress said, that God is in favor of walls, right?
Yes,
walls
Nehemiah.
Are biblical.
Yeah.
Pull it from Nehemiah. And when he said that, I thought it was kind of tongue-in-cheek. Maybe he doesn't actually believe it. It sounds a little bit insincere. But then this person, Tim, doubled down and quoted Acts 17:26, basically the old verse that segregationists used to use, right?
The Bob Jones verse.
Exactly.
I have a sermon on my phone about him using the language.
I thought, oh my gosh. So, and they talked about like, the Bible, borders are biblical. Number one, like no historian, no biblical scholar would apply the modern concept of a nation state, apply it to the kingdoms, of ancient Babylonia and so on. It's just not going to happen. So people aren't thinking historically. They're not thinking critically. And
really quick, I just want to read that passage. Acts,
go for it,
the audience. Acts 17:26. From one man he had made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. This verse, friends, if you listen to the show, you should know by now, but if you're new, this verse is like one of the key proof texts for early segregationists to say, look, like the races need to stay separate. Black people don't belong with white people. And here's the proof text. So hearing anyone quote that verse to argue for this kind of rhetoric, it's like, dude, you don't know what you're drawing on, do you? Like, you really don't. or you do, and that's even scarier. So
Yeah, Sergio has something really important that he's working on with respect to conservative pushback to sanctuary in the 80s involving evangelicals and some heavy hitter religious thinkers. But I want to say one last thing about this real quick.
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
I think, Tim, with respect to immigration, this is an issue where evangelicals, Bible-centric people, right, believe in the many literal word of God, fundamentalists even, Pentecostals, they lose the Bible war to their more, let's say, progressive Christian counterparts. And they're not used to losing Bible war. They're not used to losing a scriptural kind of back and forth proof texting. The Bible is a book about an immigrant people, right? A diasporic people. And we have so many texts in the Hebrew Bible, in the New Testament, that the go-to is for detractors of sanctuary and immigrant causes. Oh, Romans 13, respect authorities that are there. Like, okay, guys, Paul's writing to the Romans, right? Writing to the saints in Caesar's household, basically.
Right.
He's being tongue-in-cheek, but
also, where was that during COVID? Oh, that's right.
Know.
You justified why that wasn't the case. Like, but, yeah. Anyway, I could rant forever on this.
They lose a scripture war, but Sergio has far more interesting things to say about the 1980s, conservative reactions.
I think the problem with being a historian is sometimes you hear these arguments, you just roll your eyes because it's just recycled, right?
Totally.
I mean, it's old wine and new calfskins, or whatever the saying is.
Yes, new wineskins.
Yeah, new wines. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Bravo! That's the evangelical line. I'm proud of you, Sergio.
Where did I pull that from? Sojourners in the 1980s argue against conservative detractors of the sanctuary movement. I mean, as Lloyd mentioned, I mean, there were some heavy hitters. The biggest one is the Institute on Religion and Democracy, which is still around today. They were founded in the 1980s as this Christian bulwark against creeping communism in the United States. And They identified the sanctuary movement as the biggest Trojan horse, bringing communism into this country under the cloak of Christianity, right? And so the thing, of course, to note is that the people who are engaged in sanctuary activism are not some neophyte religious, come latelys to this
Join
movement.
me, comrades.
Exactly. I mean, first of all, their number one obligation is to their faith, right?
Right.
And so, for us, as we study the sanctuary movement, we engage in these arguments because it's necessary to understand them. But it's the historical actors themselves who have time and time again responded to them. As Lloyd mentioned, the Old Testament has 36 injunctions to welcome the stranger, right? So many references to do this very simple thing, which is to look at the person who has you at your doorstep as someone who has been made in the image of God, not as some villain, some enemy, or someone who is there to rob from you. So,
right.
What we're hearing today, it's old news.
It's old news.
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, I am no historian. I just read the works of historians like yourself. And when you start reading them, you do start seeing patterns like very quickly, right? And so you're completely correct. And, I tend to laugh instead of yell because there's only two emotions for me to handle this. Either we have to laugh about it in some language, in some way, or I just start screaming and yelling at how absurd this rhetoric is, but also not just the absurdity, how effective it is.
Yes.
That's what, more than anything, if one thing grinds my gears, it is watching Ali Stuckey say shit like that, and people are like, oh yeah, that is sound, that's a sound biblical hermeneutic based on Orthodox Christian teaching. And in my head, I'm like, oh my God, like, have you read one book, just one? Mm-hmm. Beyond like the bubble.
The one.
Yeah, just the one. Like, just read it for yourself. Like the Bible's clear. And honestly, I get frustrated because, especially after I kind of deconstructed and got exposed to how we got our Bible, what the Bible is, all that stuff. I don't like playing the proof texting game because I don't like to take things out of context myself. I don't. But sometimes you have to fight the fire with fire and be like, look, if we're going to proof text, here's all the proof texts, and then let them justify why the Bible doesn't really say what it says. And then you got them in the typical trap of like, whoa. You guys can't claim that the Bible's clear when it suits you and then somehow justify things that don't. Scott Coley he's a great philosopher, wrote a book called Ministers of Propaganda. He calls it motivated literalism, how these folks have a motivation behind what they tend to interpret as literal and not literal. So I just think that's a very important point. Okay, couple quick questions here, and then I'll let you go. So here's what I hear a lot in the Christian nationalism. Hey, undocumented immigrants or illegals, they've very broken the law. They've very broken the law. There are inherently, all of them are criminals because they've broken our laws because they're here illegally. What's your response to that?
I mean, all of us break the law every single day. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. That's a ridiculous one. That's the first one, right? All of us break the law every day. Number two is that immigration law, as Lloyd already mentioned, is changing every single day. And I would venture that anyone who listens to this podcast, much less Lloyd or I, have no idea what immigration law actually entails. After like financial law, it is the most complicated legal system in this country, right? It is so intricate that it's impossible for us to understand. And someone who's a criminal today was not a criminal 10 years ago or 20 years ago, because the United States gets to shift who gets to be a criminal when they remake immigration law every single year.
Yeah, quickly, I go back to Elie Wiesel, right, who at the Sanctuary Conference in 1985 in Arizona said, no human being is illegal. So you might have seen the bumper stickers, the banners, right, that say that. That goes back to a Sanctuary Conference. And, it's just so curious that it's only with respect to immigration that the transgression of the law sticks to the person as an inherent quality. They are an illegal, or they are illegal. You don't say that of people who have shoplifted, of people who have done more egregious things like murder. You don't say, oh, they're illegal because they broke the law. And that's a kind of quality that is really only carried by immigrants. And I think that's baked into xenophobia. And that goes back decades, if not centuries.
Okay. Here's another one. And this is verbatim. Okay.
Oh boy.
There is a great replacement that is happening, right? There's a great replacement that's happening where they essentially, the deep state, whoever wants to shift the body politic and essentially erase the votes of the true Americans. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, sorry, I have a similar reaction. Like, it's ridiculous, so you ridicule with laughter. I mean, there was a claim, right? Biden's trying to do all this to make the asylum seekers be able to vote. Number one, like, they're not on a path to citizenship. That's just a non-starter, right? And great replacement theory is, it is born and bred with xenophobia. That's what it boils down to, right? Fear of the others. What I mentioned earlier about the Leo Chavez kind of analyzing of images, go back to that. That becomes the basis of much of this replacement theory.
I mean, I think there's this assumption that non-white people are going to inherently vote for Democrats. And I mean, I don't know, just look at the last election and see some of the swings in the electorate to see that that's certainly not the case. And so not only is it xenophobic, nativistic, and white supremacist, it's also stupid because it's not based on any sort of data. We're going to continue to get these fears because I think it's of course kind of indicative of other fears. It's fears about not enough white babies in the world. It's fears about obviously a changing demographic, but it's also the reality that demographics is not destiny. And that's, I think, at the nut of it, which is that there's nothing inherent about Black or brown people coming into this country and their political identities. And as Lloyd said, I mean, I can't even vote. What is this?
Yeah. Okay, we'll do one more. Hey, look, dude, guys, if they just followed the law, if they just went through the legal process, okay, they would be here legally. There would be absolutely no problems. What's your response to that?
Number one, maybe fast. Okay, what's the legal process look like? Just answering like that, and that just throws someone into confusion because the legal process is so complicated. Having family that's gone through this or going through it or has been denied this, that is hard. And Tim, 99.999% of people who ask that kind of question cannot answer what the legal process looks like. And so the legal process also, law is shaped by, imperatives of the administration. So, legal process is always changing. And when you're suffering, when you're down and out, when your family has experienced violence, when the only way out is to get out, then I don't think people really care about, this is the right way of doing it. They care for survival.
The second thing I'll say, of course, is just to remind people in the 1980s, the sanctuary movement was born when the United States was not following immigration law, right? I mean, asylum law very clearly stated who should have been allowed. And I will point as well that under the Trump and Biden administration, they reformulated asylum law, right? The 1980 Act very clearly states who should have access to political asylum in this country. And under the pretenses of COVID and under the so-called, migrant crisis at the border, both Trump and Biden basically shut down the asylum process. So who's the one who's breaking the law here?
Right. And let's not forget, I mean, most recently in Springfield, Ohio, with the Haitian immigrants, propaganda that they were eating dogs and cats, J.D. Vance said, first off, that they manufactured the story. And then when he was given the fact that they were actually here legally, he said, well, the way that they're here legally, we don't count as legit. He essentially said the way that Harris did it, or that Biden did it, or the Harris administration, right? He's trying to tie it back to Harris. The way that they did it was illegitimate and not real. So again, it's not even about legal status, because those people had legal status. They're actually courted by the state and by the town to come work legally. But for J.D. Vance and Trump, no, we reject the validity of that legal status. So, it is a nonstop game of just like gymnastics after gymnastics. Goalposts are always moving, but it all ends somewhere. And I think the result is who benefits, right? And you look at who benefits, and also what are they trying to maintain? Why are we always hearing stories about brown-skinned immigrants? Always. Why is it always targeting groups of people, communities that do not look like the typical white American? They will not say it so bluntly these days, although they are getting closer to saying it. It's only a matter of time before we hear Nick Fuentes level propaganda come out of J.D. Vance's mouth. I mean, they're not too far. They really aren't. It's only a matter of time. But all that propaganda leads to the insinuation that, well, white people, we don't really want too many dark-skinned people around here because, look, like they're more criminal and they're more uneducated or whatever it is. All this dehumanizing language. And I just think that, this is an opportunity more than ever for the church to be incredibly loud and to push back on other Christians. Jim Wallace says the answer to bad religion is not no religion, it's better religion. And honestly, I agree with him. Like, I have plenty of secularist friends, plenty of atheist friends, and I love them, but you're not going to get rid of religion, first off, in our lifetime. It's never going to happen. But number two, you can't combat bad religion with secularism. It doesn't work because they can't speak the language. You need Christians, especially people who were born similar to my background, these white evangelicals who have changed their position, because this be very loud because they can speak the language and they can kind of translate this stuff in a more common vernacular that can resonate with more and more people. So there's a lot of work for us Christians who are listening to the show and other influencers and stuff and people like yourselves to do, because we have to create new narratives and change the narrators and take back the narrative from the Charlie Kirks and your Matt Walshes and your Shapiros of the world that does so much damage for so many people.
And at the end of the day, I mean, folks who support whatever immigration platform it is, right? You have to ask yourself, am I loving my neighbor as myself?
Yeah.
Is this something that you would want to have done to you if you were in their shoes? And that's just plain old Jesus rule, right? The second of the greatest commandments. You got to love your neighbor as yourself. You got to always ask yourself that question before proceeding.
Yeah, if your faith in politics is built on excluding people, then I think your faith in politics is a little messed up, right? And I think if you are Christian, that is not what Scripture is telling us to do every single day of our lives.
I agree. Listen, Sergio and Lloyd, it was really great having both of you. I mean, we have to continue the conversation. This cannot be a one-off. Consider yourself a friend of the show. Let's have you back on next year as things develop. We're going to need people like yourself. Honestly, I tell all of my academic friends this. We need academics and scholars more than ever, and we have to connect them to people like me who just don't really know what's going on and putting it in layman's terms so we have a better understanding of what's going on. So let's definitely keep in touch. Do you guys have public platforms? Are you on, I'm not going to say Twitter because fuck that, but do you have Blue Sky or Threads or Instagram? Like, are you anywhere else that's public?
You can check. Blue Sky is the best place to find me these days. Yeah, off of that Twitter as much as I can be.
And what's your name on Blue Sky?
Oh my gosh, Lloyd, tell them where you are while I look up what my handle is.
I have Instagram, El Profe Barba, so ELPORFE, then my last name Barba, El Profe Barba, Instagram, Threads as well, and I think I'm also on the former Bird platform, but I think I'm going to take flight to bluer skies very soon.
I feel that.
And I'll probably make the same handle there.
I got you. Okay, I follow.
And I'm over at SM Gonzalez, GONZALEZWI at Blue Sky if you want to find me over there.
Sergio's always holding out for Wisconsin. I love that about him.
That's it, man. Listen, this is the thing. As J.D. Vance said when he visited our great state, every state is a border state now, including Wisconsin, which is funny because we've always had Canada up the north. We've always known we're a border state. So.
Love it. Well, again, guys, thanks for joining me. Let's keep in touch. And you're doing great work. Keep it up.
Appreciate it, Tim.
Thanks,
See ya.
Tim.